I never knew his real name during the war, but I married him after recognizing his voice in a library. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of the Columbia University Library, each droplet catching the amber light of the reading lamps scattered throughout the vast hall. Margaret Sullivan adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and turned another page of her dissertation research, the familiar rustle of paper mixing with the quiet murmur of students and the occasional creak of wooden chairs. It was October 1952, 7 years since the war had ended. Yet the memories still visited her in unexpected moments, triggered by a scrap of music on the radio, the smell of cigarette smoke, or the particular quality of light filtering through autumn clouds. If you enjoy these heartfelt stories, consider subscribing to Romance in the War for more beautiful tales. She was reaching for her coffee cup, now grown cold, when a voice drifted from somewhere behind the towering shelves of historical texts. The voice was reading aloud, probably for a study group discussing something about European reconstruction efforts. Margaret's hand froze halfway to her cup. The cadence was unmistakable, measured, thoughtful, with just the hint of a Chicago accent softening the consonants. More than that, it carried a particular warmth, like honey poured over gravel, that had once been the only thing keeping her sane during the longest nights of 1944. Charlie, she whispered to herself, the name escaping her lips like a prayer. But that was impossible. Charlie wasn't even his real name, just his radio call sign during those months when she'd worked the midnight shift at the Red Cross Communications Centre in London. She'd never seen his face, never known his surname, never learned anything about him beyond the fact that he was stationed somewhere in France, coordinating supply drops for resistance fighters. Their conversations had been strictly professional at first, but as the weeks turned to months and the bombing raids grew more frequent, something deeper had developed between them across the static-filled airwaves. Margaret stood slowly, her dissertation forgotten, and made her way toward the voice. She moved carefully between the stacks, her heart hammering against her ribs in a way it hadn't since she'd heard the all-clear sirens over London. Around the corner of the European history section, she found him. He sat at a small table surrounded by 3 other graduate students, all leaning in to listen as he explained something about the Marshall Plan. His hair was darker than she'd imagined, a rich brown with threads of premature silver at the temples. His hands moved as he spoke, long fingers sketching invisible maps in the air, and when he smiled at something one of his companions said, tiny lines appeared at the corners of his eyes. Margaret pressed herself back against the bookshelf, suddenly feeling foolish. 7 years was a long time. Voices could be similar. She was probably mistaken, projecting her own wishful thinking onto some poor, unsuspecting graduate student who just happened to have a pleasant speaking voice. But then he laughed, a low, genuine sound that she'd heard exactly 3 times over the radio during their months of communication. Once when she'd told him about the time she'd accidentally broadcast her coffee order to half the Allied forces in Western Europe. Once when he'd described his sergeant's increasingly creative profanity during a supply shortage. And once, during their last conversation, when she'd finally worked up the courage to tell him that talking with him had become the best part of her day. That laugh erased any doubt. Margaret found herself moving closer, drawn by a magnetic pull she didn't entirely understand. The group was discussing post-war economic policies, but she barely heard the words. Instead, she studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way he unconsciously pushed his hair back when he was thinking, the small scar above his left eyebrow that she never could have known about from their radio conversations. The challenge, he was saying, was that local populations often didn't trust Allied supply drops. They'd been burned too many times by false promises or misdirected aid. Building that trust required radio operators who could establish genuine relationships with resistance contacts, people who understood that behind every call sign was a human being risking their life. Margaret's breath caught. He wasn't just speaking academically about wartime communications. There was something personal in his voice, a weight of lived experience that confirmed what her heart already knew. One of the other students, a young woman with blonde hair pinned in the latest fashion, leaned forward. That sounds incredibly isolating. All that responsibility, all those relationships, but never actually meeting the people on the other end of the radio. He was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the table's wooden surface. "Not entirely," he said finally. "There was one operator in London. Call sign was Songbird, probably because she had this habit of humming while she worked. I could hear it sometimes when she forgot to release the transmission button." He smiled, but there was something wistful in his expression. "She kept me sane during some of the darkest months of the war. Never knew her real name, never saw her face, but I probably told her things I'd never told anyone else." Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She remembered those late nights when exhaustion and fear had worn down all their professional barriers. She told Charlie about her childhood in Vermont, about her father's death when she was 16, about her fear that she'd never be brave enough or smart enough to make a real difference in the world. He'd shared stories about growing up in Chicago, about his dreams of becoming a teacher, about the weight of coordinating drops that meant the difference between life and death for resistance fighters whose faces he'd never see. And yes, she had hummed. It was a nervous habit she'd developed to calm herself during the longest, most anxious stretches of waiting for radio contact. She'd never realized he could hear it. "Excuse me," she found herself saying, before she could lose her nerve. The group looked up at her, and she saw his eyes for the first time, warm brown, exactly as she'd somehow known they would be. There was a moment of polite confusion as he waited for her to continue. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I couldn't help overhearing you mention radio operations during the war. I worked communications for the Red Cross in London." Interest sparked in his expression. "Really? What sector?" "Coordination with French resistance networks, mostly midnight shifts." She paused, gathering her courage. "My call sign was Songbird." The change in his face was immediate and profound. Color drained from his cheeks, then rushed back. His eyes widened, and he half rose from his chair before seeming to remember where he was. "I'm sorry," he said to his study companions, his voice slightly hoarse. "Could we continue this tomorrow?" They gathered their books with curious glances between Margaret and the man she'd known only as Charlie. When they were alone among the tall shelves, he stood fully and took a step toward her. "Margaret," he said, and hearing her real name in that beloved voice nearly undid her completely. "Hello, Charlie," she managed. "Thomas," he said quickly. "Thomas Mitchell. My real name is Thomas Mitchell." They stood there for a long moment, two people who had shared their deepest fears and hopes across thousands of miles of war-torn Europe, now separated by only a few feet of library air that felt charged with 7 years of wondering and remembering. "I looked for you," Thomas said suddenly. "After the war ended, I went to London. I tried to find out who Songbird was, but the Red Cross said their wartime personnel records were classified. I spent 2 weeks walking around the city, hoping I might hear your voice in a crowd or a shop." Margaret felt her heart break a little at the image of him searching for her through London's busy streets. "I looked for you too," she admitted. "I asked about Chicago-based radio operators, but there were so many, and I only knew Charlie. I didn't even know if that was short for Charles or just a nickname." "It was short for my middle name, Charles. Thomas Charles Mitchell." He took another step closer. "I can't believe it's really you. I mean, I hoped when you said Songbird, but I didn't dare." "It's me," she said softly. "It's really me." The years seemed to collapse between them then. She could see the young soldier he'd been in the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head when he was listening intently. He could probably see the earnest Red Cross volunteer in her careful posture, the same hands that had once operated radio equipment, now clutching research notes. "You became a teacher," Margaret said, noticing the books on education theory among his study materials. "Graduate school at Columbia, education policy. You said you wanted to do something that mattered after the war, something lasting. This felt like the right way to honor what we all went through." He paused, studying her face. "What about you? Last I heard, you were thinking about journalism." "I was for a while. I worked for a newspaper in Vermont for 3 years, but I kept thinking about all the stories from the war that never got told, not the big battles or political decisions, but the human connections, the ways people found hope in impossible circumstances." She gestured to her books. "Now I'm working on my doctorate in history. My dissertation is about civilian resistance networks and communication systems." Thomas smiled, and it was the same smile she'd heard in his voice 1,000 times. So we're both still trying to make sense of what happened over there. I think about those nights sometimes, Margaret said. Not the fear or the bombing, but the conversations. The way we could talk about anything, even when everything felt hopeless. I saved some of the transcripts, Thomas admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. The ones that were just routine coordination, nothing classified. I probably shouldn't have, but... He trailed off, then met her eyes directly. They were the most honest conversations I'd ever had with anyone. I didn't want to lose that completely. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. I kept a diary. Not about operations, I was careful about that, but about how those conversations made me feel. About Charlie, who made the worst nights bearable just by being there on the other end of the radio. They were standing closer now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to notice that he still had the habit of pushing his hair back when he was nervous. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said. "That last night, before the communications center was relocated, you started to say something and then the connection cut out. I always wondered..." Margaret remembered that night vividly. The bombs had been falling closer than usual, and word had come that her unit would be moved to a safer location the next day. She'd known it was likely their last conversation, and the words had tumbled out before she could stop them. "I was going to tell you that I loved you," she said simply. Not in any dramatic way. "I knew we might never meet, that the war would end, and we'd go back to our separate lives. But I wanted you to know that loving you had made me braver than I'd ever been before." Thomas reached out then, his fingers barely touching hers. "I was going to tell you the same thing. I'd been trying to work up the courage for weeks." The confession hung between them, 7 years late but no less powerful for the delay. Margaret looked down at their hands, his larger and scarred, hers pale from too many hours in libraries, and felt the same flutter of connection that had sustained her through the war's darkest moments. "This is going to sound presumptuous," Thomas said, "but would you like to get coffee? I know a place near campus that stays open late. We have 7 years to catch up on." Margaret laughed, surprised by how natural it felt. "I'd like that very much." They gathered their books and papers, moving with the comfortable coordination of people who had always understood each other, even across impossible distances. As they walked through the library's grand entrance hall, Margaret caught their reflection in one of the tall windows, 2 people in their late 20s, carrying the weight of shared history and the tentative hope of a future that neither had dared to imagine. The rain had softened to a gentle mist that seemed to wrap around them as they stepped onto the Columbia campus. Street lamps created pools of warm light along the walkways, and Margaret could hear the distant sound of jazz music drifting from one of the dormitories. "I have to ask," Thomas said as they walked, "do you still hum when you're concentrating?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Sometimes. I didn't realize how much I did it until you mentioned it just now." "I loved that sound," he said quietly. "It meant you were there even when we weren't actively communicating. Like a heartbeat that let me know I wasn't alone." They found the coffee shop, a narrow place squeezed between a bookstore and a jazz club, with mismatched tables and chairs that looked like they'd been collected from various decades. Thomas ordered black coffee. She chose tea with milk, and they settled at a table by the window where they could watch the university's late-night life pass by. "So," Margaret said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup, "Thomas Mitchell from Chicago. Tell me everything." He laughed, the sound just as she remembered it. "That could take a while. We have time now," she said, and realized as she spoke that she meant it in every possible way. Thomas began to talk, and Margaret settled back to listen. He told her about growing up on Chicago's South Side, about the father who worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat, and the mother who made sure her children understood that education was their pathway to something better. He described his years at Northwestern, the professors who had encouraged him to think about teaching as a way to change the world, one classroom at a time. Then came the war years, not the operational details she already knew, but the personal cost. The nightmares that had taken years to fade, the difficulty of forming relationships with people who hadn't shared that particular kind of intensity. The way civilian life had felt almost unbearably trivial for the first few years after his discharge. "I think that's why I ended up in graduate school," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "I needed to understand what we'd all been through, to put it in some kind of historical context that made sense." Margaret nodded. I felt the same way, like I'd lived through something enormous, but I couldn't quite grasp its shape or meaning. Writing about it helped, but only to a point. What did you write? Thomas asked. Articles at first. Human interest pieces about veterans coming home, about the women who'd worked in factories, and then had to figure out what came next. But they felt incomplete somehow, too focused on individual stories without the broader context. She paused, considering. I think I was trying to write my way back to that sense of purpose we had during the war. That feeling that what we were doing mattered absolutely. And did you find it? That sense of purpose? Margaret looked out the window where a group of students was walking by, their voices bright with laughter and the particular energy of young people convinced they could change the world. I think I'm starting to. This dissertation, the research I'm doing, it's about the networks that kept people connected during the worst of times. How human relationships formed and survived under impossible circumstances. Thomas smiled. Like ours did. Like ours did, she agreed. They talked until the coffee shop began to close around them, the owner politely stacking chairs and sweeping floors while they finished their conversation. Margaret learned that Thomas lived in a small apartment near campus, that he taught undergraduate history classes to pay for his graduate studies, that he'd never married because he'd never met anyone who understood the person the war had made him. She told him about her years in Vermont, about the newspaper job that had felt like playing house with a life that didn't quite fit, about the loneliness of trying to explain to civilian friends why she sometimes woke up listening for air raid sirens that would never come again. I need to ask you something, Margaret said as they prepared to leave. That last conversation we had, did you mean what you said about the resistance fighters, about how the relationships radio operators built with contacts were based on genuine understanding? Thomas considered the question seriously. I meant every word. Why? Because I've been wondering for 7 years whether what we had was real or just an artifact of extreme circumstances. Whether two people could actually fall in love through radio conversations, or if we were just projecting our need for connection onto voices in the static. He reached across the table and took her hand properly this time, his fingers intertwining with hers. Margaret, I knew your laugh before I knew your face. I knew the way you sighed when you were tired, the way your voice changed when you were worried about something you couldn't control. I knew that you bit your pencil when you were thinking, because I could hear the little tapping sounds. I knew you were brave and kind and funny, and that you cared more about other people's safety than your own. He paused, studying their joined hands. Maybe that's not how love usually works. Maybe most people need to see each other, to share physical space and everyday moments. But what we had was real, even if it was unusual. The war stripped away all the normal social conventions. We had to be completely honest with each other, because anything else was too much work to maintain across that distance. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes again, but these were different from the tears she'd shed earlier. These were tears of relief, of a question finally answered. I used to worry that I'd made you up, she admitted, that you were too good to be real, too perfect a companion for those impossible nights. I worried about the same thing, Thomas said, but here we are and you're even more remarkable than I imagined. You're Margaret the graduate student, Margaret the journalist, Margaret the woman who spent 7 years trying to make sense of what we lived through. But you're also still Songbird, still the person who kept me anchored when everything else was chaos. They walked slowly back toward campus, neither wanting the evening to end. The mist had cleared, revealing a sky full of stars that seemed impossibly bright above the city's glow. Can I see you again? Thomas asked, as they reached the point where their paths would diverge. His toward graduate housing, hers toward the small apartment she shared with another doctoral student. Margaret smiled. I think we have a lot more catching up to do. Tomorrow? He asked hopefully. Tomorrow, she agreed. Thomas leaned down and kissed her then, softly and carefully, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Margaret kissed him back, tasting coffee and possibility and the particular sweetness of a hope that had waited 7 years to be fulfilled. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Margaret Sullivan, he said. I loved you when you were Songbird, and I love you now that you're yourself. I love you too, Thomas Charles Mitchell, she replied. I think I always have. They parted reluctantly, with plans to meet the next day at the same library where they'd found each other again. Margaret walked home through the quiet streets, feeling as if she were floating several inches above the sidewalk. In her apartment, she pulled out the diary she'd kept during the war, pages and pages of careful observations about a man named Charlie who had become the center of her emotional universe without her ever seeing his face. She read a few entries, amazed at how accurately she'd captured his personality, based on nothing but voice and words and the spaces between words. October 15th, 1944. Charlie told me about his mother's apple pie today. Not the recipe. We're not allowed to share personal details that specific, but the way it made his childhood kitchen smell like cinnamon and safety. I could hear homesickness in his voice, and something else. A kind of tenderness that makes me think he'll be a wonderful father someday, if he gets the chance to come home from this war. November 2nd, 1944. Bombing was heavy tonight, but Charlie stayed on the radio with me even after the official communication was finished. He told me jokes, terrible ones, until the all clear sounded. I think he was more frightened for me than I was for myself. There's something beautiful about being cared for by someone you've never met, someone who knows your voice but not your face, your thoughts but not your daily habits. It's like being loved for your essence, for the irreducible core of who you are. December 3rd, 1944. I think I'm in love with Charlie, not in love with the idea of him, or with the romance of our impossible situation, but with him, with his kindness and his intelligence and his ability to find hope in the darkest circumstances. I know this makes no practical sense. I know the war will end eventually and we'll go back to our separate lives, but loving him has made me braver and stronger and more myself than I've ever been before. Margaret closed the diary and smiled. Tomorrow, she would share these entries with Thomas and he would probably show her the transcripts he'd saved. They would piece together the full story of how two people had found each other across the chaos of war, and how they'd managed to find each other again in the quiet sanctuary of a university library. But tonight, she was content to sit by her window, looking out at the stars and marveling at the strange paths that love could take. 7 years ago, she had been a young woman operating a radio in wartime London, falling in love with a voice in the static. Now she was a doctoral student in New York, and that voice had become a face, a hand to hold, a future to imagine. Some stories, Margaret thought as she prepared for bed, were worth waiting for. Some love was strong enough to survive separation, uncertainty, and the passage of years. Some connections forged in the crucible of extraordinary circumstances were meant to last a lifetime. In her dreams that night, she heard Thomas's voice again, not as it sounded now, filtered through coffee shop acoustics and nervous excitement, but as it had sounded over the radio during those long-ago nights, warm and steady and impossibly dear, calling her back from the edge of fear and loneliness. "Songbird," the voice said in her dream, "you're not alone. I'm here. I'm always here." And when she woke the next morning, sunlight streaming through her windows and the sounds of campus life beginning another day, Margaret smiled and whispered back to the memory, "I know, Charlie. I know you are." The future stretched ahead of them now, full of possibility and promise. They had found each other twice, once across the impossible distance of war, and once again in the quiet sanctuary of learning and hope. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Two voices finally joined in the same physical space, two hearts that had learned to recognize each other across any distance. Some love stories begin with a glance across a crowded room. Others start with a chance meeting or a mutual friend's introduction. But theirs had begun with static and call signs, and the particular intimacy of voices in the dark, and had waited 7 years to become something they could hold in their hands, something they could build a life around. It was, Margaret thought, as she dressed for another day at the library, exactly the kind of love story the world needed more of, the kind that proved human connection could survive anything, that hope was stronger than distance, and that sometimes the most important conversations happened between people who had never seen each other's faces. Today, she would see Thomas again. They would sit in the library where their story had begun its second chapter, and they would continue the conversation that had started in 1944 and would probably last the rest of their lives. And maybe, if she listened carefully, she could still hear the faint echo of radio static in the space between his words, a reminder of where they'd come from and how far love could travel when it was meant to be.